Now I invite Dr. S. Panja for the next topic, critical care cardiology. He is a coordinator and senior consultant from Medica Institute of Critical Care, Kolkata. And I invite chairperson Dr. Pramod, Director Cardiology Department, Paras Hospital, and Dr. Ajay Sinha, Senior Cardiologist, Paras, Patna.
Is there a write-up for him? Introduction है कहीं
While he's being introduced State team who has organized this, a very good morning to everybody. Cardiology has become a very integral part of any critical care management anywhere, because we face it day in, day out. Every day we get calls that there is some kind of arrhythmia, there is a hypertension. Maybe let's look at the LV function. In fact, there are series which have shown that in critical care, the incidence of LV dysfunction ranges something between 20 to certain studies have shown up to as high as 90%. So it's very important part the correct LV assessment in any critical care patient is of paramount importance. So we invite Dr. Panja to enlighten us on this aspect.
Before that, let me be a word. Let me welcome you. We are from Paras Hospital, and we are from cardiology department, where we get frequent call from your department, department of anesthesia, department of critical care, and very trivial problems like severe sinus bradycardia, severe sinus tachycardia. In a setting of septicemia, if somebody is having a heart rate of 150, and I know there are limited number of drugs which can cause. Can you show the first slide can you show the first slide, please? The previous slide. Excuse me. This is why I am put this, because this is very relevant. I mean, those who are working in critical care, they are at least 25% of cardiology skill has to be there. I think all of us, Gurudev, Dr. C.R. Das, Dr. Atraf, Professor Asaf, was my teacher. This patient came to my clinic. I just want to give brief in 30 seconds before we start the elegant lecture by the erudite Dr. Panja. This gentleman came to the clinic, had inferior MI, had problem in the morning, something like cardiac arrest in the morning. Wife tried to revive. Somehow lucky he revived, got her revived. In the morning he came to my clinic. Again, the moment he thought that I am having MI, inferior MI, he had a cardiac arrest. He fell down. We made him lie on the floor and asked his wife to lift the leg, whatever we do, and then cardiac massage. And then I called up the ambulance from this hospital. Before that, I sent the patient straight to the lab in the vehicle of one of my friends, and within half an hour, primary angioplasty was done and on RCA, and till date, patient Mr. Pandey is doing very well. So, what I mean is, critical care is an area where passion has to be there. Saving life, nothing else. Sir, please.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Chairman Sir, for brief introduction, and I must thanks Dr. Kishore, Dr. Robi, Dr. Deepak, and Paras Hospital, our critical care colleagues in Patna for inviting me for this lecture. And already my chairman sir told that this is one area where each and every intensivist, every day we are dealing with some of our patients. Most of the patient is having some form of cardiac problem. Maybe in the tune of, in some center it may be 60%, some center it may be 70, 80%. So depending on the what type of patient actually we are managing, our percentage of patient is having significant portion of the patient has got some form of cardiac problem. So this is some of the social things that happened in the last year, selfie, and this is this vapor, e-cigarette. So all these things in cardiology also there are so many areas where there are so many developments. But in brief, in 30 minutes I will try to cover some of the interesting areas what I find that every one of us should know. And just before that, this is one case of 50 years old lady, hypertensive, diabetic, and past history of the PTCA. Sorry, this is PTCA. It is PTCA. And patient was admitted with 1 day history of dyspnea, cough for 1 day without any history of any fever, expectoration, and that breathing difficulty was progressively increasing, and there was orthopnea also. And what would be the probable diagnosis and as well as management? Because this type of patient we very often we used to come across in our day-to-day practice as well as in clinic practice. So basically this is in first instance it is an LVF or a left ventricular dysfunction, either systolic dysfunction or diastolic, whatever it is. Basically it is cardiac failure, acute cardiac failure, quite common in the critical care areas or in the obviously in cardiac unit it is very common. And this I have taken from the NICE guideline 2014 October they had published. This is one guidelines. I will not cover the evidences that is there because this is guidelines for the time constant. So in their guidelines they have mentioned that there should be a very good interested doctors. They are basically dedicated to the heart failure team. They should be included and they should be manage all this type of cases because there are so many things we normally used to do in our day-to-day practice but the evidence is lacking. That's why once the patient will get admitted, very brief history about the clinical profile, and then we should get one ECG, chest X-ray and blood test. That is the preliminary thing we can do, and no gadgets, nothing, no big gadgets like echocardiography or EA. And because we are practicing in different areas, so what we can do if the facilities is available for BNP assessment or NT-proBNP, because these are very good tests that we can send. And right now there are kits available. So depending on the lower limit, they will give you whether positive or negative, that can be given. And once this is positive side, then we can call for urgent echocardiography. And if it is high, our probability for the diagnosis for the heart failure is more. So we should treat this type of patient as acute heart failure. And in people where either this is normal or that this facility is not available, then we will try to find out if echocardiography is possible at the earliest, preferably within 48 hours. And routine use of the pulmonary artery catheterization is no more practice in most of the places because there are so many doubts about the pulmonary catheterization as well as particularly interpretation of the data. And as Dr. Somadra was already mentioned that it is not the basically any gadgets or it is the basically intervention. Depending on the interpretation of the results, you should intervene. That actually change the practice. So that's why pulmonary artery catheterization is not necessary. And once this type of patient is admitted with acute heart failure, so what are the things we should do? Normally what we used to do earlier, that opiates and all these things to reduce the pulmonary artery pressure as well as venous return. So they discourage that use of the opiates to people with acute heart failure. And then we should immediately start the patient with the intravenous diuretic therapy. Intravenous diuretic therapy at this juncture, I will mention that some of the patients are already on diuretics. Then you should increase the diuretic doses up to the highest limit. You can give either bolus or continuous infusion, that according to their guidelines. And if already patient is having the diuretics, then you gradually increase or in the incremental doses of the hourly infusion of any diuretics. And during that time, you should monitor the urine output as well as electrolytes. That is very important, particularly potassium, because some of the patient might have that hypokalemia that can cause devastating result with this cardiac problem. And next, we should always discuss the best strategies of coping up with an increasing output. Because if the urine output is not even with the highest dose of diuretics, then there are other things that we can do that we have to discuss. Because particularly some of the patients might have either cardiorenal syndrome or maybe pre-renal failure because of the cardiac problem. And next they had mentioned that do not routinely offer the nitrates to people with acute heart failure. But there are some exceptions if there is myocardial ischemia or there is basically severe hypertension and regurgitant aortic or mitral valve disease. That time you can offer nitrates. And do not offer sodium nitroprusside to people with acute heart failure. That is very important. and routine use of the inotropes of vasopressor is basically not necessary unless there is cardiogenic shock or patient is having a BP of say less than 90, systolic blood pressure, perfusion pressure is very low, that time you can use. So till this time the first line of therapy is basically diuretics therapy in the initial phase, increasing diuretic dose and look at the urine output and monitor. And where is in selected cases you may use nitroglycerin, and then you can also consider if cardiogenic shock is there depending on that vasopressor or inotrope. Regarding the non-pharmacological therapy, that is non-invasive ventilation, that normally we offer. Routine use in the initial phase may not be basically not necessary. Some of the patient might have basically on acute presentation they have CO2 is rising, that time you can offer, or even with the diuretics patient is not improving, then you can consider this therapy as an adjunct therapy. And invasive ventilation, if the patient is particularly drowsy, then you can consider the invasive ventilation, or patient is having shock, that is even after inotropes and vasopressor patient is not improving or blood pressure is not improving, that time to reduce the work of breathing as well as to reduce the stress on the patient, you can consider invasive ventilation. And what I already told, if we are using the highest doses of diuretics, still patient is not passing urine and patient is symptomatic, then what is the next step? Then we should consider the ultrafiltration for this type of cases. So ultrafiltration can be considered for the diuretic resistant cases. Once with these therapies the patient is slightly better, then you can consider for some form of chronic therapy, particularly beta blocker, AC inhibitor, and that time beta blocker should be ideally once after diuretic therapy the patient is slightly improving, then it is the time when you can actually give the beta blocker. And that time we should take precaution, heart rate should not be less than 50, or there should not be any third degree or second degree advanced block, AV block, that can cause again problem. And this beta blocker may be started after say diuretic responsive therapy or within 48 hours preferably after the patient is getting admitted in the critical care or any cardiac care unit. And angiotensin receptor or angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitor should be offered once the cardiac ejection fraction on echocardiography is low, that is usually less than 40%, then those patients will be benefited. And otherwise routine use they have not encouraged much about this and closely monitor the patient renal function, electrolytes, because particularly this AC inhibitor or ARB has a potential to increase the creatinine level as well as they may cause hyperkalemia. That's why this electrolytes monitoring is very important, urine output monitoring is important. And during that time we should also look for what is the definitive therapy or what this patient is having cardiac failure. It may be either myocardial infarction or it may be because of some valvular disease that we should address, and that obviously we should take help from the cardiologist colleague. And other mechanical devices like IABP therapy or any ventricular device, because IABP is very common in most of the most centers in our countries, as well as I think in Patna also most of the hospital has got this facility. So IABP should be offered where you are thinking that this is a reversible cause of heart failure as a bridge of therapy, or someone is waiting for some form of therapy like bypass surgery or PTCA. So if the patient is having refractory shock, then you can consider the IABP therapy. And some of the controversial areas, what they mentioned that these are the controversial area, more research is needed, like dopamine therapy, because dopamine, as you know, if we give dopamine, there is a theoretical chance that it will increase the urine output as well as that may cause actually change the patient profile. But that has not been cleared, and there are so many, basically last 10 years there are so many articles, meta-analysis, everyone has been published with dopamine. So dopamine issues has not been cleared. So if we actually giving dopamine, this will be a controversial thing and research is needed. Thiazide, particularly metolazone in the name of Gitanics, sometimes we use as additive drug. So this is again another area of the controversy, and though we normally practice that with diuretics, metolazone, because there will be a theoretical chance of additive effect, and practically it may happen, but they have suggested for more bigger randomized control trial. Intra-aortic balloon counterpulsation in the early phase, whether that will be beneficial or not, that is another issue. And ultrafiltration issue, whether we can early, before actually when we will call that diuretic resistant state, before that can we start the ultrafiltration or not? These are the areas needs to be discussed, and there is no clear guidelines when to start or in these areas in these guidelines. So this is something about the acute heart failure, whether systolic, diastolic heart failure in the critical care management or in the management in the intensive care unit. And next there is some issues about the, as we know, most of us face the cardiac arrest scenario. Is there anybody who don't face cardiac arrest scenario in their clinical practice in life? So I think that this is one of the major area of problem, concern. There are so many things, as well as we have seen that the social effect also, because if patient is having cardiac arrest and doctor is not doing anything, so automatically that will really impact and the attendant of the patient will cause so many problems, create problems. So cardiac arrest in the clinical practice is very common. And after cardiac arrest, so patient's brain suffer from hypoxemia or hypoperfusion. So that is the thing. So after that, what is the next step? How patient recovers? So basically, after once patient already suffered cardiac arrest and there is hypoxemic brain injury, there is nothing other than some of the supportive therapy and wait and watch and look for the look at God. Okay, what finally actually reflects. So there are some predictors, there are something that clinical judgment, pupillary response, brainstem reflexes, as well as patient consciousness level, all these clinical parameters we normally look for to find out or to brief to the patient's attendant about the prognostication of the case, whether patient will survive or not. Because this type of patient may have to be in the ICU or critical care for longer time, the cost is also a concern. So in these guidelines, normally there is one concept that hypothermia may prevent brain damage because of the concept that it may decrease the CMRO2 as well as reduce the ICP. So with that concept, but once you have put the patient on hypothermia, it is usually 24 hours to 48 hours, you may not actually get the what will be the future picture. But in this guidelines, heart rate may predict survival and brain function in comatose cardiac arrest survivor before actually 24 hours when you are initiating the hypothermic therapy. So during that time, if you look that there is some heart rate variability, some patient is having bradycardic response, some patient is having tachycardic response. This bradycardic response is much better with the hypothesis that if bradycardia is a response to the hypothermia, it means at least brain is functioning. And if there is tachycardia, it means the very likely that this brain is not functioning, because this is one reflex action of the brain in response to the hypothermia. So this is very new. This has been basically in a good, it has not been till now published, but the researchers what they have seen in the Denmark study. So from 2004 to 2010, they had taken all the retrospective analysis. They included 234 comatose survivors out of hospital cardiac arrest. Basically, the cardiac arrest happened before patient attended to the hospital. From the out of hospital, patient got admitted. Then during that time, hypothermia was being initiated. So during that hypothermia, they had actually retrospectively analyzed what was the profile of this patient and heart rate variability. And what they found actually that with this analysis, they had seen that if there is bradycardia during the time of hypothermia, the mortality is much lower than the tachycardic group or who has no bradycardia. And patient had almost 70% 180 days mortality rate compared to 38% in those with no sinus bradycardia. And so sinus bradycardia during therapeutic hypothermia remains an independent predictor of lower 180 days mortality with a heart rate of with a hazard risk of 0.51 after adjusting for known confounding factors like AS6, comorbidity, witness status, and bystander CPR. Why it is important? Because you can early, say in the 6 hour or 8 hours period, you can talk to the family about the future prognosis, whether this patient is going to actually better outcome or worse outcome, that you can do. And if you look at this 180 days mortality, if patient is having sinus bradycardia, the mortality is much lower in comparison to no sinus bradycardia. So that's why the author mentioned that patient with sinus bradycardia during therapeutic hypothermia had 50 to 60% lower mortality rate at 180 days than those with no sinus bradycardia. And in final conclusion, now when we observe that a patient experiences sinus bradycardia below 50 beats per minute within the first 24 hours, we can tell families that their relatives may have a chance of recovery. But if it is not there, chance of recovery will be much less. And this is another area about the hypothermia. I don't want to discuss this issue because my colleague Dr. Devashish will later on discuss that when we are basically inducing hypothermia, what will be the temperature 32, 33, 34, 35. So that is there is some controversies. Okay, so actually in this article what they had mentioned that they had basically observed that if you are inducing hypothermia with the temperature 33 degree versus 36 degree, the outcome is more or less same at the end of 6 months. And I don't want to go in details because Dr. Devashish will later on cover this thing. This is another interesting study that some of us may actually also dealing with the post cardiac care unit, critical care post cardiac surgery unit. So there is another problem with the prognosis, and some of the patients are doing good with the after surgery. Some of the patients may not do well after surgery. So in this actually study, what they had evaluation of the PaO2 FiO2 ratio after cardiac surgery as a predictor of outcome during hospital stay. Why it is interesting? Because this is a very simple tool, and PaO2 FiO2 ratio can be measured in almost of the critical care setting. So that's why there is no bigger gadgets that is necessary. So in this study, they actually prospectively studied almost 2,700 patients with after surgery. So in that surgery, there were basically bypass surgery, other valvular surgery that was there, and they studied between 2004 to 2009. And they had actually serially measured the PaO2 FiO2 ratio at 3 hours, 6 hours, 12 hours, like that serially they have measured. Then they had tried to find out if there is any relationship with this hypoxemic status of the patient and future outcome. So what they observed basically, there are some of the survivor group in the post cardiac surgery and some of the non-survivor, and they had basically looked at the PaO2 FiO2 as well as time. So the survivor group had better PaO2 FiO2 ratio in comparison to the non-survivor ratio, and then they had analyzed the whole result. So they had also adjusted the baseline characteristic of the survivor group and non-survivor group, as well as they had tried to match that, and there was well match between these two groups. And what they observed, if the PaO2 FiO2 ratio after basically serially measuring, and they had taken different quartile, means PaO2 FiO2 ratio of 200, 200 to 250, 250 to 300, like that. And after that they observed that if the PaO2 FiO2 ratio is less than 200 at 3 hours, so the chance of mortality as well as the hospital stay. So in this PaO2 FiO2 ratio with lower, they had more mortality in the ICU, in the hospital, as well as stay in the critical care unit was much higher. And this is the PaO2 FiO2 ratio of less than 202. So they had shown with the cumulative survival. Cumulative survival was much higher. So this is the survival card. So in the Kaplan-Meier analysis, the survivability was much higher with the better PaO2 FiO2 ratio. So with that, they have basically, after taking different quartile, what they observed basically, finally in conclusion, they had shown that in summary, PaO2 FiO2 ratio may be an useful indicator of post-cardiac surgery patient about the future prognosis. And if the PaO2 FiO2 ratio is lower at 3 hours interval, usually less than 242, the chance of respiratory complications was much higher, and if it is less than 202, the chance of survival was much lower, or the mortality is much higher. And the key message from this study was that PaO2 FiO2 ratio may be useful to identify at-risk cardiac surgery patients in the immediate post-operative period. And the PaO2 FiO2 ratio at 3 hours after the ICU admission had the highest prediction power in terms of outcome. Because they had studied at 3 hours, 6 hours, 12 hours from that, but they had finally, once they actually statistically analyzed, it is the 3 hours period when the PaO2 FiO2 ratio, if it is lower, the chance of the respiratory complications, ICU stay, as well as the odd outcome in terms of mortality was much higher. Respiratory complications are more frequent when the PaO2 FiO2 ratio at 3 hours is lower than 241 and poor outcome when the ratio was below 202. So that I think this can be practiced in different post-cardiac surgery units or critical care units. And just I will request anyone of us are not basically using anticoagulants for our patient. So I think everyone is using the anticoagulant in any form, either it is oral anticoagulant, parenteral anticoagulant. So for our patient in prevention of the DVT or sometimes for the other to prevent some thromboembolic manifestations after atrial fibrillation or any cardiac arrhythmias. So there are so many changes in last 1 or 2 years in this area, new oral anticoagulant in clinical practice, because initially it was started with non-valvular atrial fibrillation. Then they had looked at the safety profile as well as there is no need for the monitoring of like PP, all these things. So with that, gradually the horizon of using these particular medicines has been increasing from the non-valvular atrial fibrillation for the prevention of stroke, DVT prophylaxis, DVT treatment, pulmonary embolism treatment, and right now there is also another horizon is coming, that post-coronary artery disease, if there is acute occlusion or acute coronary syndrome, it may be used. So in the last year there was actually FDA approved the EPIC-7 for DVT PE treatment because earlier it was not there, and the NICE draft guidelines also recommend that rivaroxaban to prevent blood clot in people who have an heart attack or acute coronary syndrome because of the blockage in the coronaries. And also the rivaroxaban earlier used only for the non-valvular atrial fibrillation. They are right now gradually may be used also in the valvular disease, valvular heart disease with atrial fibrillation. So if we look at the defined oral anticoagulant, because we should know when we should use this and what are the drawbacks of using all these oral anticoagulants. What is the beauty is basically if we are using the warfarin, the conventional oral anticoagulants, either for the prevention of future DVT or prevention of stroke patient in atrial fibrillation. So problem is with the warfarin, we have seen in India that there are so many patients are coming from the rural areas or they are not from a very educational background. So the INR monitoring regularly as well as to adjustment of the dose may not be there. So that's why we have seen that so many patients got admitted with devastating complications. But if we are using these oral anticoagulant like dabigatran, rivaroxaban or EPIC-7, so there is no need for monitoring of the PTA, PTT, and this can be given orally. Only problem is the cost constant. So if we look at the target, how they are working, this warfarin we know vitamin K antagonist or epoxide reductase inhibitor. If we look at the dabigatran is factor 2A inhibitor, but this rivaroxaban and EPIC-7 they inhibit directly factor 10A inhibition. So that is their mechanism of action. And if we look at the food drug, basically this dabigatran is food drug. So after it goes inside the body, that becomes the active metabolite. And if we look at the bioavailability, the bioavailability is much higher for this in comparison to dabigatran, the rivaroxaban and EPIC-7, the bioavailability is much higher. The interesting thing is that plasma protein binding. Plasma protein binding is much higher for this rivaroxaban and EPIC-7 in comparison to this dabigatran. And if we look at the renal problem, the elimination is from most of the elimination for the dabigatran happens from this renal route. But in rivaroxaban, EPIC-7, the rivaroxaban is 66% renal excretion and EPIC-7 is 27% renal excretion. So that's why in these three drugs, dabigatran, rivaroxaban, EPIC-7, if there is renal impairment, it is better that we can put the patient on the Apixaban in comparison to rivaroxaban or terbinafine, because of the most of the drugs in other two are basically excreted through kidney, but Apixaban is much lower excretion through kidney. And next question is, if there is bleeding with this type of patient, like what pain patient is getting, if there is bleeding, we know either we can give the vitamin K or FAP. But in case of these oral anticoagulant, till few months back there was no drugs that was basically antagonize these effects. But recently there is one drug that is basically they have come across that phase 1 trial that can be used for this for that antagonism of this oral anticoagulant. But till now, because it is the phase 1 has been basically passed, the phase 2 trial and as well as phase 3 trial should be passed, then that can be used later on. And if we come to the individual drug, the dabigatran, so that has been used in atrial fibrillation, the post either knee surgery, hip surgery for prevention of the DVT. And with these defined trials, that was basically been proven that it is basically non-inferior to the low molecular weight heparin, like either usually enoxaparin. So that's why it may be used. And this is the Rayleigh trial. In that trial, actually, with atrial fibrillation patient, so they have seen that the dabigatran with 150 milligram daily was superior to warfarin in reducing stroke or systemic embolization with a similar bleeding profile. Because if we look at this is the basically dabigatran arm, and this is this warfarin arm for the basically stroke or any systemic embolism. So if you look at this profile, they had a more or less similar profile of the stroke or any embolic manifestations. And also if we look at the major bleeding was there or not, it is also matched. So that's why it was basically non-inferior to the warfarin or warfarin in terms of the stroke prevention in atrial fibrillation. And similar studies in the rivaroxaban was also there with a more or less similar patients with atrial fibrillation as well as any patient post actually knee surgery or hip surgery for the prevention of DVT, that was also non-inferior to any low molecular weight heparin or warfarin. And in this rocket atrial fibrillation trial, they had also shown that this was basically the rivaroxaban was also non-inferior to any oral anticoagulant, so that may be used. And this is about the Apixaban with defined trials in the Apixaban, more or less similar indication like atrial fibrillation, post knee surgery or hip surgery, DVT prophylaxis as well as post pulmonary embolism, the prevention of the recurrences. So these are the defined Averroes study, Aristotle trial, and so in final year we should know about how to prescribe these drugs. For this prescription of the drugs, basically for the prevention of the DVT or post, basically prevention of the deep venous thrombosis post orthopedic surgery, three drugs may be used, but the doses we should adjust according to the renal function. If the renal creatinine clearance is less than 15, nothing should be used. And if the renal clearance is between 15 to 25, then Apixaban may be considered, but the dose should be reduced. And for the dabigatran or rivaroxaban, you should not use if the renal clearance or the creatinine clearance is less than 30. For the rivaroxaban and for the dabigatran, if it is less than 60, it is better to avoid. And for the prevention of stroke or systemic embolism in the atrial fibrillation, that can be used. And treatment of DVT in following the treatment of DVT, pulmonary embolism as well as prevention of recurrences, only rivaroxaban in the name of Xarelto that can be used after the pulmonary patient has already developed pulmonary embolism for prevention of recurrence. So these are the major indications that we should know. And for renal clearance, I am not going in details of this. And next question is, if your patient is already taking basically oral anticoagulant, how can you switch to the oral anticoagulant? From warfarin, how can you go to this novel oral anticoagulant? Or sometimes patient is taking novel oral anticoagulant, how can you go this? So there are guidelines. So in that guidelines, if the patient is basically already from this warfarin or the vitamin K antagonist, to novel oral anticoagulant, how can you go if you are planning to give the dabigatran? So discontinue the warfarin or vitamin K antagonist and start dabigatran when the INR is less than 2. So if your patient is on oral anticoagulant in the form of warfarin, so you should monitor the INR. Once your INR is less than 2, that time you can use dabigatran. And for the rivaroxaban Epic-7, so once your INR is between 2 to 3, means less than 3, then you can use this rivaroxaban or Epic-7. So Epic-7 is available in the name of Eliquis. Okay. So are you all, I think, aware of this three common trade name or Indian marketed names, that is the Pradaxa, Xarelto and Eliquis. These are the common names that we normally use. There are other few companies that are coming with different names. But if your patient is from the novel oral anticoagulant like Epic-7 or the dabigatran, you want to go to the warfarin for whatever reason, particularly if the renal function is impaired, then there are also guidelines how can you go in that. Okay. So I don't want to go in that details. You can just take my presentation and go through this. Next concern was, this was basically FDA was being approved, then post-marketing there is also the bleeding concern, whether it is practically happening or not, because we know there will be enough market pressure because of most of the companies, whoever is coming with this novel molecule, they are the inventor and they always try to twist the results. So that's why post-marketing survey was done for the post-marketing bleeding episode, but in that year the FDA has also done some sentinel initiative for the actual bleeding, what is happening. So in that study also these molecules has passed. So that's why from the safety side, post-marketing side, it is more or less safe. And this is the new drug, that is whether there is any antagonist against this oral novel anticoagulant is there or not. And this is the molecule idracizumab. So in this molecule, actually this molecule has been tested in the phase 1 trial, right now it is in the phase 2 trial, and very likely that this molecule was initially used against dabigatran patient if the experimental model that is bleeding, and it has also been shown some efficacy against the Epic-7 also. So it may be that in coming 1 or 2 years we may get some antidote for these oral anticoagulants. And there are some few changes about the ACLS guidelines. This guidelines is very minimum because acute coronary syndrome is very common in critical care practice as well as OPD practice, emergency practice. In that ACLS guidelines, there are some small subtle changes. So at whatever level we are practicing, if patient comes to us with the acute coronary syndrome with probable AMI and if the ECG is showing some ST elevation, so from the symptom onset to the actually medical help, this is the patient delay. You cannot do anything. So once patient comes to you, so then we should look for the whether I have a center or I am working with center with facilities for the primary cardiac intervention or not. So if percutaneous cardiac intervention facilities are there, then this ST elevation AMI should be immediately, we should actually plan for the angiography as well as if that is intervention required like angioplasty or here we should go. So this is a bit upfront, and from that the patient is coming to the healthcare facilities to the intervention. This balloon time from the patient actually health basically advice to the balloon time, this should be within less than 90 minutes. So if I have a center with PCI facilities, the time has been cut down to less than 90 minutes. And from door to balloon time means if my patient has come to the emergency to balloon time, it has been reduced to only 60 minutes. But if I am in a remote place working say 100 to 200 kilometers away from Patna or some places where there is no facilities, then what can you do? These targets will remain safe. But in between, if these facilities cannot be availed, then we can consider for the intravenous thrombolytic therapy at the earliest. With that intervention, basically intravenous thrombolytic agent, we should send this patient to the nearest PCI facilities and they will judge whether this patient is having patent patent coronaries or non-patent coronaries. It means after getting that another ECG or other modalities, if the successful fibrinolysis has not been done, they will take this patient for the percutaneous intervention, or if the patient is having successful fibrinolysis, that time patient may be basically considered for the PCI intervention after within 24, usually within 24 hours. So why it is? So why it is important? Because we have a different level of practice, so we can basically, we have a clear mind that if my facilities are not there, at least patient will get thrombolytic agent, and then we should actually transfer the patient with the center where there is PCI facilities. And that is also in last 2004, that is basically guidelines in the JNC 8. JNC is basically that is a body who actually gives guidelines about the management of the hypertension. So last year the JNC 7 was being published, I think in 1997 or 98. There was a long due, or the public, basically everyone was thinking, waiting for this JNC 8. That guidelines was being published. I don't want to go in detail. There is no much thing. Only thing is basically they have there is a change in the blood pressure target goal. Target goal only to basically summarize, if the blood pressure is, most of the scenario, the blood pressure target goal is systolic blood pressure should be less than 140, diastolic less than 90, and if the patient is more than 60 years, then the target is basically less than 150 and lower one less than 90. So that is the subtle differences. And in the critical care areas, there is no much basically any guidelines for this particular set of patients in terms of critical care blood pressure management or in this guideline. And this is about the how you can initiate the therapy. There are just 2-3 slides, some of the changes that has happened very interesting. Because the pacemaker weight has gradually reduced to right now it is only 2 gram pacemaker, cordless, wireless. So directly it can be inserted in the heart. So this is a very interesting technology is coming, but only problem during insertion there was some basically rupture of the cardiac muscles. So that's why there is some caution about this in the marketing strategy. There is another thing, sometimes post myocardial infarction there will be arrhythmias. That arrhythmia may persist, say 3 months is an average period when this cardiac remodeling happens after myocardial infarction. And then you can take decision whether if your patient is suffering from cardiac arrest followed by low ejection fraction in terms of less than 35% ejection fraction or 40% ejection fraction, patient is having in between arrhythmias, then you can consider this patient for the AICD or internal cardiac defibrillator. But these 3 months what will happen? Because either you cannot put this one in situ defibrillation pacemaker, or problem is that this 3 months is the first most crucial time when this patient may suffer acute cardiac sudden death. So that's why this has been devised, that external cardiac defibrillator patient can wear for this first 3 months, and if some of this patient is having basically problem after 3 months, and that time patient can be put on AICD technique. And if the patient gradually recovers with the ejection fraction is coming up and there is no event, then you can just put that patient with medical therapy, no intervention. And this is basically one new drug, that is angiotensin neprilysin inhibition versus enalapril. So I don't want to go in details for this drug. This is one new drug is coming, but in the acute setting or critical care setting, I don't know the relevant. This is mostly for the basically chronic heart failure therapy. But definitely gradually it may also come up in the acute heart failure setting where we are actually practicing. And there was atrial fibrillation. Sometimes some of the patient may have some contraindication for the anticoagulant therapy, because they may have some complications because of the either oral anticoagulant novel or the older. So that's why this is, I think, maybe interesting that there is left atrial appendage occlusion. Because in atrial fibrillation what used to happen, there is left atrial appendage. This is the most vulnerable area where there may be clot formation. So in this device they directly can insert one device so that they can occlude this area. After occlusion of that area, chance of thromboembolism will be much less. With that hypothesis, they have devised this technique, and this is also in use right now. But there is again concern about the FDA advisory plan, that is basically split on basically whether this can be approved or not. So that's why it is still now basically not being used so frequently, or it has not been by the FDA clearance has not been done. So this can be sometimes used. So with this, I must thank everybody for patiently. And if there is any question relevant to any areas I have covered, I will try to answer.
Any questions from the audience? I have a question to you. Sorry for that. We are using ivermectin these days very frequently in heart attack. And what I have learned from my colleague here, and it gives an excellent result. And there are a lot of concern about using beta blocker in acute heart failure now. I mean, it's a drug which can worsen heart failure,
Yes.
and there are some issues. So, what is your because you did not mention about ivermectin.
Actually, I told you, there are maximum development, updation and everything has happened in the cardiology field. And if you look at the whole, actually cardiology updates should be a 3-day session as I can understand. So ivabradine as of now we are using definitely, as my chairman sir told, that because beta blocker in the acute setting may cause decompensation in the ear, the ivabradine in critical care area, there are some of the areas they have shown that it has got some positive effect. Particularly, I am giving some of the patient is having hypotension. So systolic blood pressure is less than 90 sometimes. So that time, but patient is having tachycardia in the range of 160, 170 or like that. So that time ivabradine may be used. There is also role of the ivabradine in some subset of patient in the sepsis group, because some of the septic patients, they are having 170, 180 heart rate and patient is having a borderline blood pressure. So use in sepsis patient, that can be considered. And also there are some patients with the ARDS and the COPD group of patients with heart rate very much, and these COPD patients, they frequently used to get all these salbutamol or any beta 2 agonist and also other drugs that can basically complicate, like theophylline rare patient is getting, so they can also increase the heart rate. So these are the some areas that may be used other than the per se cardiology side, like post myocardial infarction and all acute coronary artery disease. Basically in critical care side, a patient is having say sepsis, septic shock, or sometimes some patient is having a very unexplained tachycardia, that is in the 130-70. Only problem, if there is so much of tachycardia, what used to happen, there will be basically diastolic time will be much less. So the diastolic feeling of the heart will be much less. So that's why finally again it can decompensate the heart function. So that's why it is interesting to have ivabradine in this armamentarium.
For that, my question is related to the PaO2 FiO2 ratio that you have presented in post-cardiac surgery patients, and that has been linked to the outcome. Now, my question is that PaO2 FiO2 is generally used to find out whether the lung is functioning well as an oxygenator or not. Now, in this situation, when patient is having a post-cardiac surgery situation, the blood flowing through the lung would be qualitatively and quantitatively inferior because of cardiac reason, and then it is flowing through the lung, but through PaO2 FiO2 ratio we are trying to evaluate the lung function.
Actually,
so how is it correlated?
It is interaction between the heart and lung, okay? And 3 hours is a time, because immediately, what was the problem? In the immediate post-cardiac surgery, there will be a time, say 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. So what they had gradually basically tried to find out the PaO2 FiO2 ratio at 0 hours, 1 hour, 3 hours, to 6 hours, 12 hours, all these things. And then finally, I think maybe because at the 3 hours period is the time when there is a bit of the synchrony between the cardiac as well as lung, because heart and lung in this PaO2 FiO2 ratio, it is not only the indicator per se in this pulmonary side here, it is together pulmonary as well as cardiac side. And this is the time when there is the time when the patient has come out from that acute bad stressful situation of the surgery to a state of say around a kind of balance when it will basically finally will be translated in the recovery. So that's why in the 3 hours, in the defined quartiles, in defined period time frame, they had seen that it is 6 hours they had also analyzed. 6 hours analysis was not that very corroborative. So that's why actually they had analyzed, all the analysis was done in the each hours, means 3 hours, 6 hours, but they found that there is best correlation was being made at the 3 hours period. And here it is not only the pulmonary, it is basically pulmonary as well as cardiac. Maybe what I have understood that it is because of the insult of the surgery as well as the morbidity that was there earlier as well as the post-surgery morbidity. That may be the reason that is there.
It is a deviation from the usual thinking process, where actually POT5 is generally used for the lung assessment. Here the cardiorespiratory function was evaluated, so this is deviation.
Means why I have found is very interesting because it can be done anywhere. It is not, it does not require any kind of your major thinking as well as gadgets. So that's why, and you can in the early phase you can say your patient actually needs real better care or not, because from this you can intensify your therapy as well as monitoring.
Can this be extrapolated to other conditions?
I don't know that.
Because we have a lot of such patients who are kept on.
Actually, medical science is believing on extrapolation. Okay, then new things come. So definitely we can extrapolate our thinking to other.
There in our CCU, which require a lot of support. Could you recommend that or partially recommend that it's possible?
Sir, really, I cannot recall because
Same problem, cardiorespiratory is there.
See, actually,
Because-
deciding the action
Ah.
plan, sorry, the deciding action plan will be difficult. When you are depending the POT factors is being used for the lung pathology primarily, which actually it is advocated for, then you know what to do. But when it is because of cardiorespiratory problem or some other problem for which the blood which is going through the lung is qualitatively and quantitatively inferior, then at that situation, what action plan will you be taking, that is the question. Then again, we'll have to assess the different systems.
Just want to share with heart failure and cardiorespiratory exercise. This was my topic one time back in National CSI conference. And I gave a lot of ideas that how exercise can improve all these parameters which you said.
yes.
So extrapolating all those things, would it be possible that we have a parameter like this to assess our patients in CCU?
I think because this is an observational thing and it is not basically intervention in terms of that per se. I can definitely we can try in other areas also, because at least what I have understood right now, earlier we used to think pulmonary as a defined thing, cardiac as a defined, but if you look at the most of the problems, it is basically cardiorespiratory rather than only being cardiac or respiratory. Even as we are managing a COPD patient, this patient is having an interdependence ventricle. Because of this interdependence of the ventricles, there is failure on the left side also, where we are expecting right-sided failure. That is one problem. In another side, sometimes patient is having say left ventricular failure that is causing some pulmonary edema. There is pulmonary hypertension and acute right heart syndrome. So that's why these are interesting that it is not only the cardiac, either pulmonary or cardiac, it is together cardiopulmonary. And also Dr. Samadar was discussing that time, there is an interaction. Interaction means that even in the hemodynamic monitoring as well as fluid challenge, because once we are dealing with this pulmonary component or cardiac component, it is together cardiopulmonary. I think philosophically it may be true, because that's why God has created both the organs together in one compartment. So that's why that interaction is there.
So, thank you very much.
Thank you.